Welcome to the Albany Book Festival online, presented by the New York State Writers Institute at the University at Albany. You can learn more about the festival and find direct links to independent booksellers at our festival webpage, albanybookfestival.com. Follow us on social media and hear from more videos from the Writers Institute.
Good morning, everybody. I'm happy to welcome you to this hopefully very interactive session. And there's no formal procedure. It's meant to be a Q&A. So I would just like to start it by introducing two of my friends. One, a lifelong friend, Jay Parini from Middlebury, Vermont. Jay has written more than 35 books, and some of them come out in 35 different languages. His most famous book is the historical novel, The Last Station, which won some awards when he transferred it into the script with Michael Hoffman, Best Independent Film of the Year, 2012. Helen Mirren plays Mrs. Tolstoy, and Christopher plays Mr. Tolstoy. How many of you have seen The Last Station? It's a must for all of you. And then you read the historical novel. Jay landed that plane. Jay also writes great books about Robert Frost biography of Faulkner, biography of others, including Christ. Jay is a poet and one of America's real treasures. He'll be here interacting with the next generation of great writers, Daniel Sherrell, who his book that came out recently called Warmth is profoundly moving, constructed as a 4-part symphony, a set of movements about climate loss and climate rage and hope. It's, in my mind, the new Walden. And if you don't have the time yet to read the book, Warmth, you can get him to sign your copy after this. And you could also watch his TED Talk, which is what I use when I want CEOs to check out his work. So without further ado, Jay and Dan, if you could come up. As they come up, I'd like to have you think about 3 words. So this is Jim Collins' great book called How the Mighty Fell. He sold 5 million copies of From Good to Great. But since this is a book about arrogance and destruction, How the Mighty Fell, no one buys Jim's book, How the Mighty Fell. But I'd recommend that you check it out. It's a book about the benefit of respect, the cost of revenge, and the damage to reputation when you become arrogant. I think these 2 men are masters of thinking about the future from those 3 lenses. Jay and Dan. Jay, do you want to start?
Let's begin again. Now you can hear me. I was talking about Dan Sherrell's wonderful book, Warmth, which is a memoir of climate change. And it's about his own life as a young man, activist, working to get climate change legislation passed here in the state of New York. And it's written in the form of letters to an unborn child, and imagining what it's like for children. What is it like? I have 4 grandchildren, and it is heavily on my mind, thinking, what kind of world are they inheriting? Where they'll still be around. I won't be here in 2050. And what is this planet going to look like then? And I feel great guilt for what my generation has not done to combat climate change. But Daniel comes along at a time with just the right moment, I think. And as I said last night when I was introducing him, it's a polemical book. A polemical book is one that wants to change our minds, but really change our hearts. And he does so not with statistics. I mean, statistics make everybody's eyes glaze over. Bar charts and all that stuff, bar graphs and charts. We can't really, that doesn't have much effect on people. But I think that the feeling he gets into a book like Warmth can actually change people's minds. And I'd love to hear Dan talk about that. And he's going to read a little passage from his book. As I said, I'm interested in memoir. I did edit a volume of anthology of memoirs many years ago, and I've been interested in the form, life writing. And I just did my own first memoir after all this time. I wrote a book about Borges and me, about a trip I took 50 years ago in the highlands of Scotland with the great blind ancient Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges. And we traveled around the highlands of Scotland together for a very short period. And it was an extraordinary time. And I'm interested in how one approaches memoir. I think Dan could talk about that as well. So I'll turn it over to Dan.
Thanks so much, Jay. An incredibly generous introduction from an incredible writer. I don't want to speak too much at the beginning here before reading, but I just want to say that I wrote this book. I first started putting pen to paper when I was 27, and had at that point been active in the youth climate movement in this country for the better part of a decade. And I didn't know I was writing a book when I started. What instead was happening was that I would wake up every day normally, and my work entailed an endless string of conference calls and emails and sit-ins and lobby days, all of them geared towards compelling our governments to take action adequate to the problem of the climate crisis. And even though I was ostensibly trying to take action on that problem with every action I took in my day-to-day life, it remained sort of abstract to me. It would kind of sit in this Pandora's box behind my shoulder that I rarely opened, like emitting a low frequency of anxiety at all times, but it wasn't something I had the time, I felt, to examine. But I could feel as I did this work on what felt like a problem whose immensity made it feel almost ungraspable, that there was like a knot in my chest of undigested raw feeling about the future, about the present, about the prospect of starting a family, and about many of the things that I loved that were now in dire jeopardy. And I sort of intuited that if I didn't unravel that knot, and if I didn't honestly compel myself to have an emotional encounter with the thing that I was ostensibly taking action on, to try to metabolize its enormity, then I wouldn't be ready for life in the 21st century. So this book did not start off as a book. It started off as like little jottings in the Notes app on my phone, in journals, sort of as a Hail Mary autotherapeutic process. I didn't feel like there were many avenues culturally to air one's climate grief and to digest it in public and community, which felt strange to me because this is one of the things that is going to most shape life on planet Earth for the next several centuries. And yet it existed nowhere in the public sphere on the level of emotional and spiritual discourse. And so that made me feel very lonely. And so I created this imaginary interlocutor, this hypothetical child that I may or may not have, to alleviate that loneliness and to start to unravel that knot. And so this is the book that eventually came of that. And I'm going to read a passage about midway through the book. It's describing the day that the United States under President Trump withdrew from the Paris Climate Accord. A dark day that folks will probably remember from 2016. And I'm actually not far from here. I'm up in Buffalo, New York, where I was managing a statewide coalition of labor unions and racial and economic justice organizations, all of whom collectively were trying to pass a big climate bill. So that's the context. It was almost 2 years before the United States withdrew from the treaty. By then, Trump had been elected with a minority of votes and was systematically destroying all attempts to contain the hyperobject. It's a term I use for the problem of the climate crisis. Like a hijacker who'd wrested the controls from the pilot and was flying the plane straight into the ground, except with many, many more lives at stake. As with everything, he did his utmost to turn the withdrawal into a raiding spectacular, building suspense for weeks by hinting at various courses of action before finally announcing in a televised address suggestive of a season finale on the darkest reality TV show in the world that he would be withdrawing completely. When the announcement was made, I was up in Buffalo, meeting with several coalition organizers, among them the friend whose grandmother had been killed in Hurricane Maria. The announcement was playing on mute in one corner of their office, but no one could bring themselves to watch. On screen, Trump looked smug and bored. Pruitt stood behind him like a mannequin, cinched up into his tie. As soon as the speech began, my friend walked out of the room. I caught the first few minutes, then turned back to my pile of email, only reading the transcript once it was over. I could feel the farce congealing over the tragedy, numbing it down. I decided to take a walk around the block to see if I could cry. I came upon the lot of a small church, deserted on a Thursday, and sat down on one of the concrete strips bordering a parking spot. My sadness felt more like dizziness, the fate of the world swinging wildly back and forth, while my own life got meted out in days, one after another, effectively unchanged. Here was solid concrete, warm weather, a white steeple, the oblivious rectitude of the moment. I wanted in that instant to tear it all to shreds, to get out of it for even a second. I took out my phone and decided to call my father. Since high school, we'd begun to talk more openly about the problem. It was no longer just a subject of his research, it was all over the news. And this somehow made him more capable of talking about it, as if mounting public alarm lent him a framework through which to feel the facts that he'd helped produce. He picked up on the first ring, as he often does when I call. He was angry, he told me, livid, though his voice sounded like this was something he was still trying to muster. I loved him so much then, the way he sought to transcend his natural gentleness, will himself into indignation. Loved him because he tried, loved him because he couldn't. I wish I could feel angry, I told him. All I feel right now is sad. And then, like I'd issued a summons, the tears arrived and I was not in control of them anymore. They were just falling down my face, wetting the screen of the phone. Along one fence of the parking lot was a flowering hydrangea bush, and I began plucking its leaves and blowing my nose into them, dabbing my eyes with the sleeve. For a moment, I felt like I was 8 years old again, crying to my father in disbelief, like I was reliving that conversation we perhaps never had. But even as I experienced it, even as the force of it made me sit down and slump against the fence, a part of me was already bored with my grief. It felt repetitive and dull, an exact replay of my reaction to melancholia and to Hurricane Sandy, and to all the other moments when the weight of the hyperobject had ruptured the strength of my resolve. It was like the problem had placed my emotions on an endless tape loop, and they were going to keep playing back at me forever in the same notes, the same sequence. With this feeling came the equally predictable guilt of having never occupied a position of real vulnerability to the problem. A position that would warrant true sadness, like if your father killed himself after another crop failure, or a hurricane shredded the house where you'd grown up. The guilt exhausted me, doubly so because I suspected its actual purpose was to exercise the dissonance of privilege by effecting a moral catharsis that would mean absolutely nothing to anyone beyond myself. Sitting there in the church parking lot, it was like my whole life was being stretched out in front of me. Just one long sinusoid of elation and despair, an infinite rerun of whatever I'd already felt. This reverie was interrupted by the voice of your grandfather, who was saying something I couldn't quite hear. What? I asked him, stifling my tears. Maybe this will have the opposite effect, he repeated into the phone, a little louder this time. Maybe all the other countries will rally around it now and make the accord even stronger. I think you should still have hope. I do have hope, I told him, and it was true. I felt it like a sliver in my side, pulsing there, baiting my breath in defiance of my brain. Sometimes I wished I could extract it and let the wound bleed and heal until I didn't feel anything there anymore, didn't have anything I had to attend to. But hope possessed me with a terrible vigilance. Even after the worst news, it made my heart bounce back like a reflex, no less exhausting that it was automatic. I do have hope, I said again, and we both sat silently there on the phone, like we were waiting to see if it would hold. Walking back from the church, my tears dried up and my nose cleared. I felt like I was watching myself from afar, the distance from my own life telescoping between the sidewalk and the stratosphere, my mood oscillating with the frame. I tried my best to let it change, to move with it. Better that than the armored solipsism I knew myself capable of. All that's happening right now is that I'm walking down a side street in Buffalo. No, better to let it all in. Let the problem suffuse the world and the world suffuse my body. Let it flood through me and spill over the sides. It was June and the sun was shining hot on my shoulders. I pictured the tiny photons like dust motes, trillions of them glancing off of me, sifting through the weave of my shirt and falling into the forest of my hair. They were almost nothing, I knew, nearly massless, plinking into everything always. And yet this was the crux. This was what we were all litigating. The sunlight itself, and how much of it would be trapped here with us. I shouldn't have, but I felt then for a moment like it was all very simple. Beneath the text of the treaties and the crack of the gavel and the ever-bobbing derricks, there was just a density of sunlight, a single question. It was also clear the problem could be seen was in fact the means by which we saw. And from out of this thought came hope, seeping it back into me, unbidden and indomitable. Or maybe that's not where it came from. Maybe it was just a beautiful day and I was out for a walk in a quiet neighborhood. Maybe it was just spring. The thing is, I never quite knew its provenance. It would just always come back, offering its hand, saying, trust me. And once again, I'd take it, feeling tired, but a little thrilled. It came back, I'd think. Even after all this, it came back.
Questions, comments? I guess I'll be the provocateur. I think when you read Jay's Warheads and Me, which will become a movie soon, like The Last Station, you'll see a young man, Jay Parini, 40 years ago, traveling with an old man, a great poet. And it's about the discovery of seeing things, traveling with a blind man. So obviously great literature is often about seeing things that we're often blind to. And I think Dan's work is about seeing things. So does anybody have any questions about the rage in what you just heard? The sense of loss in what you just heard is, in a sense, I never had a father, but his description of his father, and then the hope, it's a very complex, beautiful passage. Sir.
You mentioned last night in your speech outrage at Apple and Exxon for the work they're doing in Washington. What are they doing? How dangerous is it, and what can be done about it?
Well, that's a good, very actionable question. So some folks are probably aware of what's happening in Washington right now. There's a bill that's commonly referred to as the reconciliation bill, in a way that's like just horrible messaging. Nobody knows what the reconciliation bill is, but it's this $3.5 trillion package that would invest unprecedented amounts of money in the build out of the renewable energy economy and the expansion of the social safety net in this country, so that middle-class families aren't always living on a knife's edge, one sickness or one job loss away from financial ruin. And this is, I don't think it's arguably, I think this is the most important climate legislation in the history of our country by several orders of magnitude. And most of the country's large corporations are doing everything in their power to scuttle it, to make sure it doesn't pass. By boosting up the very small number of quote unquote moderate Democrats who are in fact deep radicals willing to jeopardize the future of our planet in exchange for campaign donations or in exchange for the more subtle but perhaps more seductive benefit of having their worldview not implode on them. And it's very scary. For their credit, the Biden administration is doing their utmost to hold everything together and to get these moderate radicals in line. But it's anyone's guess what will happen. So what folks can do in this room is take 5 minutes, like on Monday, just book out the time, call your congressperson and let them know that this thing, I mean, if you like me are deeply concerned about the trajectory of our economy and of our polity and of our civilization, this bill is one of the things that could really help turn the ship around. And I think not enough people realize the gravity right now and the machinations that are currently happening in Washington. So letting your representative know that you're watching and that you care deeply about this really does change things.
Mark, do you have a follow-up? Yeah. How many of you are represented by Congressman Cole Thompson? Yeah. I mean, we're blessed that Paul is one of the people who understand energy. I mean, if you look at his congressional background, before he became congressperson, he ran the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. Before that, he was a Sept, and he's a Clarkson engineer, right? So he understands the enormity of the issue. But I think if you gave him a call and mentioned what Dan just said, and mentioned that you're behind his support, he will be able to ramify that to other people, right? And Akko is a great voice. Yes, sir.
My representative is Elise Stefanik.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
That's hard. That is hard. That's like a brick wall. She's got to be primaried, and she has to be. You have to. I would say the long.
Speed skater or the CIA guy?
Anything that will induce the most infighting. So I don't know the district that well, but.
I know the speed skater. Both of her, please.
The speed skater. Okay, you have your answer. But there's still Chuck Schumer, who's one of your representatives, and Kirsten Gillibrand. Chuck Schumer is one of the people trying to hold this all together and to talk his colleagues Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema off the cliff. And so calling his office and telling him you're strongly in support of that gives him the cover. Okay, if I get a win on this, my constituents are going to reward me. And he has to be constantly reminded that there's a high political reward for doing everything he can to hold this deal together. So if you have the regrettable reality of being represented by Elise Stefanik, I'm so sorry. And also Chuck Schumer that'll be a better, more useful call, I believe.
But I think you can still tell a blind congressperson your opinion, right? She needs to hear your opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, sir.
You must have had a chance to speak to people shortly after the case of the stealing of that home, right?
Mm.
Did you have a chance to do that? I was curious to know what you told them. How did they feel?
Can you hear me? Oh, he asked me, did I have a chance to talk to people in the aftermath of this passage when I felt that I had hope? I try as much as possible to hold the weight of the climate crisis, not on my own, sort of doom scrolling on Twitter or trying somehow to accommodate the dead facts that arrive at me through my newsfeed, but instead to hold that in community. And I hold that in the community of the social movement I'm involved in, the climate movement, and I hold that in the community of my family and my loved ones. And I find the weight is easier to digest when it's caught by a net of people rather than by an individual who feels crushed under the magnitude. I think when I talk about hope to me is not the same thing as optimism. In fact, they're very different. And optimism is a feeling of certainty or near certainty that things are going to turn out okay. And I don't feel like I have that at all. Because how could we? On the current trajectory, things are looking very, very bad. It would take a big change rather than a continuation for us to pull ourselves back from the cliff. But at the same time, I think there are a lot of people, especially people who don't think a lot about the climate crisis, but then tune into it briefly, get immediately overwhelmed, and they're like, okay, I know how this is going to end. We're all doomed. Or, you know, that whatever, the Michael Bloomberg style techno utopians who are like, don't worry, everything's going to be fine. Liquid hydrogen will come save the day, or whatever it is. Both of those, I think, are easy but ultimately false postures that substitute the difficult funambulation of living in reality with you know, the seductive thrill of certainty, because then you don't have to think about it anymore. Your cognitive load is lessened. But for me, hope is really about indeterminacy. We do not know how this is going to go. We do not know how this is going to go. And if you mix three ingredients: love, the things you're fighting for; indeterminacy, the fact that this is not a fatalistic situation, nor will it ever be; and agency, the fact that we still have the power in a pseudo-democracy to determine the actions our states take with regard to this problem. I'm not saying it's an easy equation, but that's the equation of hope for me. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
How's the knot in my stomach? Oh, that's such a good question. That's a question my mom would ask me. I appreciate that. Writing this book has been a lifesaver for me. You know, I think if I hadn't taken the time to do this, something in me would have broken. So it's not a burnout memoir. It's like a pre-burnout memoir. It's like it was kind of prophylactic in that way. And I'm checking in on it right now.
I'd like to draw an analog to Henry David Thoreau, who gave the world last century two great gifts, right? Civil disobedience, which Dan embodied. The whole notion that if you have, as Henry David Thoreau described it, a corrupt machine, an informed minority, and in a sense, change the lever of the machine as a grounds for hope. So, you know, Henry David Thoreau influenced Gandhi, he influenced many people after writing that little essay. But then he also writes Walden. And there's a passage in that book about Walden. And I would like to make the case that some of the passages in Walden, like the passage that's quite famous where he's chasing a loon, are equivalent in their emotional complexity to Dan and to not. So that Henry David Thoreau took the time to think about what was wrong about the Boston Promise. And he left that culture of leisure and that culture of great wealth and went to a little pond symbolically to figure out his spiritual core and decided a few neighbors are better than many, and his whole worldview, I think of as frugality. I think Dan, it might be worth talking with you, I'll see what he thinks. I think he's written the new Walden, but in his book he actually like Walden because he sees Walden as an escape. And I think it's because he lives in our new century where you can't escape anything. You wake up in the morning and goddamn it, it's on your phone.
Yeah.
Right? So we should talk about this idea that the whole comfort of the Thoreauian escape is not available to us, and especially to his generation. Right? So that's what the issue is. How do you work emotionally in a world where you have to liberate more Dans for civil disobedience? You have to help them get past the knot into action. Which is what your book helps them do.
Yeah, that's very perceptive, Bruce. I mean, I think you know, yeah, I'm pretty uncharitable towards Walden, and I think there are many beautiful passages, but it was sort of like I was introduced to it in high school, and it was meant to prefer the sort of romance of the wilderness, of getting outside of civilization. And even then I was like, what outside are you talking about? What outside are you talking? We all live inside now. We all live inside. There's no untrammeled quote unquote wilderness in this world that's not essentially being shaped by human agency. And to dangle that carrot in front of a generation that doesn't have access to it, and arguably Thoreau's generation didn't have access to it. You know, the native population, for example, had a very different relationship to the wilderness around Walden Pond than Henry David Thoreau did. But I wanted instead to like develop an aesthetics of the compromised, of the unraveling but still beautiful, and of the jeopardized but still valuable, and to figure out a way to create meaning, even though the sort of rarefied utopia that Henry David Thoreau offered to me, I knew in my gut would never be available, would never actually be available. And so I had to create the resources to survive in a very different place than the one he was talking about.
Certainly somebody has a comment about that. That's a very important statement. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to take a little bit of issue with that, and also suggest that this national legislation is important, but we also can act more locally. I live in the Adirondacks, which is wilderness, and we can do what we need to protect that very large 6 million acre public-private wilderness. Being citizens of the state. So I think that we need to act boldly, but also we need to protect the huge watershed or really the entire northeastern part of the country. So I think, maybe not to talk all together, but we can look at things more locally to protect what's near us.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think acting on the federal, state, and local level are not mutually exclusive. They're mutually constitutive. And we need to get both parts of that equation right to live in the world we want to live in. Because if we let the Adirondacks get bulldozed, that will be a deep tragedy. And if we let the climate warm to an extent that even if the boundary of the Adirondacks are protected, the ecosystem still collapses because it can't handle the heat, that also is a tragedy. So we have to do both. And I think people often get caught in like, where should I intervene, blah, blah, blah. I always say, find the place where you have the most political leverage. And that might be in the local town council. That might be with your member of Congress, et cetera, and push there, because there are many fronts in this. I'm reluctant to use war metaphors, but there are many fronts in this battle, et cetera.
Andrea, do you have a comment?
I think, sure. I want to just address whether there's a kind of generational piece here that's really important. But also the emotional part of it. I just said, when I heard really worthwhile in the world and building something and doing things and then also reach the point of life where we can feel more indulgent so we can enjoy more of our lives beyond the immediacy of some of these very kind of problems. We are moving towards our three days, and Dan and your generation and my daughter's generation, from the immediacy of the problem. And for your kids going on, your grandchildren, of course, you're terribly scared of whatever result we're getting. But even so, you have to see the future comforts and very simple. As you get older. And when you brought home to me, when I heard I just finished reading that book, and I heard a different urban language. One of the service was about the kind of aspect of Seattle, which is very well known, which actually about this functional family, but I think this daughter's something involved in a long time, for many years, in presentation to do with education, and actually the toll it took on the daughters really considerable. And again, children, functional families themselves, but I just mentioned it because it's actually the point of older daughters, or young daughters,
Right.
that is when the home team is, oh my God, and it's because of the relentlessness of their part of their object and the role with unchanged presentations and teaching. So this helps to bring it home that this is enormous cloud, sure, that we all live under, but that we
And that's Andrea Masters, and I'd like to make a connection between Andrea, my wife, and you in the Adirondacks. Andrea published for 30 years all the guidebooks of the Adirondacks. So she's from the ABK, and I think it's a good example of a solution set in the sense that their ethic is to not misuse that paradigm. Their ethic is smart use of it, right? Smart, and I think that's what I'm hearing you're saying. So one of my passions is to teach people how to do more with less, because the only answer to climate change is to change nation policy, change corporate behavior when you can, but also to do more with less, because as we get 7, 8, 9 billion people on Earth, the rate of consumption increases, and we're more on the petrochemical treadmill, you know what I mean? But I think the Adirondacks is a good model to study, because it's about the fixed ratio between use and preservation. And I think we have to also find that fixed rate in our own lives.
I'd like to go back for a second to the polemical aspect of your book. If we could do that, polemical is changing people's minds. I know people in my immediate family who really don't believe that climate change is a real deal. I really do. I have people in my immediate family, and I've seen, we have to remember, probably half the country, I don't know the statistic, but about half the country doesn't believe there is such a thing as climate change. What is the number?
I think it's hovering between 35 and 40 now. So it's going down, but
Still, we're talking tens of millions of people in
Yes.
America who really say, oh, well, the science isn't settled yet. Oh, yeah, it's just weather. It's not climate change. And they get really pissed off when they see the word climate change. I have one relative who says, oh, I hate to see that word, climate change. It's just weather. Why do you have to call it climate? It's just weather. And so I think, you're performing a very interesting function there. And I wonder about your future work. How do you see writing as playing a role in the life of an activist who wants to actually affect change?
yeah, that's a great question. I think that this century is going to demand of my generation, the generations below me, that we do two things. One is that we don't eschew politics, but instead try to build the power necessary to regulate the fossil fuel industry into the ground. Because right now their business model is incompatible fundamentally with the future of human civilization on this planet. And so there's enormous political work to be done to change the balance of weights on the scale of power. On the other hand, we know things are going to get worse before they get better. And I'm a strident anti-fatalist. I don't feel doom when I say that. But I know that things are going to get worse before they get better, and we're seeing that now. And so my generation will also need to figure out new ways of making meaning and new cultural avenues of processing that haven't existed previously. And I don't want to pose this as some new task for my generation. I think each successive generation has to create its own frameworks of meaning. I think we're being asked to do that on what is a particularly steep learning curve. Extremely steep, and we're very behind the eight ball. And so I see writing as one way, certainly my way, of looking up at the massive, terrifying monolith and finding a tiny handhold, and then another tiny handhold. I'm also a rock climber, so that's the metaphor that comes to mind. But that's to me what I'm doing. This book was an attempt to find those handholds in our new reality and not fall off. But I'm also interested, Jay. Some of what I was thinking about a lot in this book is just intergenerational conversations about the climate crisis and how, your generation and mine and the generation below me, the people now in middle school and high school, just were oriented very differently towards the climate crisis when we were growing up.
Yeah.
And so,
I see my own, I have 3 boys and their wives, and they're all so well educated in climate change, and they don't, there's not even a second of doubt about the crisis.
Yeah.
It's only questions of how do we solve it.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas people in my family of my generation and friends, I still have friends who say, oh, what's, I don't know, is it real? Is it real? So, that's, unfortunately, people in my generation will soon be dead. And that argument will close. I think there's going to be a horrible thing to say, but I think it's natural. And so, so that's what's going on. I've spent a lot of my own time arguing with people about climate change. And then I write about it whenever I can, but, it's difficult.
Yeah.
Getting back to the art of writing, one of the things I want to remind the group that Dan said in the beginning before he read is he used the phrase compel himself, which I think answers, we can talk about Jay's notion of the polemical. If you're a selfish self, you're not necessarily going to be a writer trying to give your generation a way of framing an answer, right? But if you compel yourself to take yourself seriously and offer something that must have taken thousands of hours to write well, right? That's the act of the writer. And then Jay points out that it's polemical writing. Part of his mission is to compel others to think about what they don't want to think about. And then another phrase he used that I learned from this morning, he wanted to metabolize its enormity. That's a beautiful phrase. It's almost a phrase for time, right? Because what he's saying is that this obelisk or this monolith before us has to be digested. It has to be appropriated. We have to find a way to participate in its shadow, right? And remain human with love and care. And I think it's such a beautiful book. That's why Andrew and I decided to bring him here, is because it's just such a beautiful book. I really recommend to read it. I think there might be other questions. Yes, sir.
I've got a 25-year-old son.
Mhm.
He's kind of going through the college experience and now getting into different. In talking to him repeatedly, and many of his friends, asked him about the future, they are very pessimistic. I mean, shockingly so, that they think my life is not going to be anywhere as good as what your life was. I am not going to be able to have the same family and things like that. Do you have those same types of feelings, or it seems like this is a way to maybe deal with something?
Yeah. I think I do have some of those same feelings, but they're more complicated than raw pessimism. I think, again, one of my key points here is that I don't know how this is going to play out, but I'm doing my damnedest to shape the outcome. I think in many ways, it's true that, I was born in the 90s, in a time where Francis Fukuyama had declared that it was the end of history. We would all live as individual consumers under capitalism, and we would shop and have a nuclear family, and then we die. And that was a very stable and in some senses pleasing set of affairs. And it was also, we know in retrospect, sort of numbing and vastly unequal. And that perceived stability for many of us here in the global north was actually built on extreme exploitation in other places. And so for me, on the one hand, yes, that system of stability is not going to be a thing I'm going to get to enjoy for the rest of my life. There's no question in my mind. And I think, for people in my parents' generation in this audience, I want you to realize that a lot of people, especially in high school right now, when they're thinking about their future, they're like, there's no point in doing any work that doesn't involve trying to in some way mitigate the climate crisis. There's no point. Because if we don't get that piece right, then nothing else really matters. That's the premise on which all of the rest of it is built. And that is an attitude that is actually shockingly prevalent and growing. Which is, I want to communicate to people the gravity of the gulf here. But I also think, the beauty of the climate crisis is that this is a crucible, right? And the only way that we sustain something like recognizable and sustainable human civilization on this planet is to build the society we always should have had from the beginning. A society in which you can't extract resources from the earth with impunity, and you can't extract labor from poor people with impunity. Those are two things on which our economy was built, and that cannot happen anymore, if only for the selfish reason that it precludes our survival. Those were auto-cannibalistic systems. We got it very wrong, and we have to radically change. And so for me, the climate crisis is this very heavy thing, but obviously, but it also puts a gun to our head and compels us to create a world of actual equity and dignity. And to my mind, that's a sort of, in some ways, it's an honor to be compelled to take up that challenge. But I also, there's so much intergenerational right now. I wanted to go back to Jay, partially because, this is my secret agenda here is just to hear about his tour of Scotland with Borges, because we must hear about that.
We need to hear from Mark. How much time do we have in this room?
Not much time left in this room.
So Jay, 5 minutes. So Jay, what's the recommendation? What do you want to tell the world about Borges?
And especially about like intergenerational, not just intergenerational schisms, but solidarity.
That I think there's a lot of solidarity, and I think the great solidarity point is that we were all young once, and that we all had to come to terms with the world, which was full of enormity. I was dealing with in this book, I'm dealing with it. I'm a young man in flight, as I was from the Vietnam War. I was being chased by my draft board. I fled to Scotland for 7 years, hiding out. I had a powerful sense that the world was coming to an end, that there was the American capitalism and the war machine had essentially become a lethal instrument that was killing millions of people, that American taxpayer dollars were being spent on the destruction with Agent Orange of a vast ecosphere, and not too long after the Vietnam War, I went back on a journalistic trip to Southeast Asia. And I remember flying over the mountains of North Vietnam and just seeing the vast defoliation, right? And I just come off of one of my best friends from high school who was on planes dropping Agent Orange.
Wow. And
he came home from Vietnam and immediately got toxic illness from that and died in his 20s. So I was, to me, yes, you have your generation's crisis right now, but I have my generation's crisis. And in many ways, they're not a different crisis. This was a capitalist war machine that was lethally destroying a landscape, a jungle, a people. 1 million Vietnamese innocents died. And it's never stopped. I've been passionate about the American war machine ever since. Look what we did in 2002. We invade Iraq. We kill hundreds of thousands of civilians. We send 1 million refugees into the world, and we create the basis for ISIS and the Syrian war, the devastation there. These crises are not this is not, weirdly, as you, I think, suggest in your book, disconnected from the climate crisis. But I think that weirdly enough, climate crisis can be foreseen as too narrow an issue. I think often among my friends who are climate activists, they fail to see how it's deeply rooted in what we used to call the war industrial complex, right? And I think that this thing, so in many ways, every generation, certainly since World War II, is dealing with how do I deal with a world where people don't understand what their country is doing in their name, how we are spending our taxpayer dollars to murder people and to destroy the climate, to destroy the ecosphere. We're shitting in our own house over and over again. And this is something that my generation understood viscerally. I was an activist myself, marching in the streets. I marched in the streets of Paris and London against the Vietnam War and continued marching against the Iraq War and so forth. The war in Afghanistan, which was an insane move in the first place, and it's come back to haunt us. So, I would say that these generational things we have to. There should be a solidarity here.
Let me try and sum up by saying, thank God these gentlemen have given us their books. You can buy their books and read their books. What I think, before we clap for them, I think the gift of a writer like Dan or Jay is that they're thrown into their moment in history, and thank God they're alert. They look at it with fresh eyes and say, here's the crises, here's the problem, right? They're thrown into the world and they don't hide. So thank you for being Dan and Jay.
If you appreciate our programming and would like to support the Writers Institute, You can find out how at nyswritersinstitute.org.